Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're setting off on a slow blister-footed march through one of the most overhyped, underplanned and blood-soaked travel disasters in human history, the Crusades. You won't need armour, just a blanket and perhaps a cup of something warm, because you're about to drift through centuries of religious fervour, logistical failure, and a whole lot of people dying horribly for vague reasons no one really agreed on in the first place. Before you start imagining gallant knights and shining crosses, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of calmly narrated historical misery is your thing. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I love hearing who's tuning in from around the world. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and prepare to be swept into a crusade, which, spoiler alert, is less divine mission and more rotting barefoot in the desert with dysentery. The year is 1095, and Europe is exactly as chaotic, dirty, and feudally fragmented as you'd expect. There's no such thing as a nation in the way you'd recognise it, just a scattered mess of lords, knights, petty kings, and deeply confused peasants, all governed by a combination of local grudges and God's supposed will. People pray to saints for everything from toothaches to better crop yields, and the line between miracle and indigestion is very blurry. Most people can't read. Most of their leaders can't read. And into this grimy stew of superstition and political ambition walks a man named Pope Urban II, who looks at the volatile landscape of Europe and thinks, what if I sent them all east? At the Council of Clermont, Urban gives one of the most effective disaster speeches in history. He tells a gathered crowd of nobles and clergy that their fellow Christians in the Byzantine Empire are under attack by Muslim forces, and that Jerusalem, yes, that Jerusalem, has fallen into infidel hands. Never mind that Jerusalem had been under Muslim control for centuries. Context is for later. Urban doesn't just suggest a military aid expedition. No, he offers something infinitely more valuable, a guaranteed pass out of hell. He declares that anyone who takes up the cross, literally by sewing it onto their tunic, will have all their sins forgiven. That's right, full spiritual reset, eternal salvation, no confessional required. Now imagine you're a minor noble who spent his adult life setting peasants on fire over a property line dispute. You're broke, covered in boils, probably excommunicated twice, and your favourite son just got kicked by a horse. Suddenly the Pope himself is telling you that you can kill people for God and get into heaven for it. That's not just redemption, that's a loyalty programme with incredible perks. It doesn't take long for the message to spread, not just among knights, but among the general population. Word-of-mouth crusade fever sweeps through towns and villages, passed on by priests, conmen, and the occasional wandering madman screaming about the apocalypse. The result? Tens of thousands of people, knights, squires, mercenaries, peasants, farmers, debtors, widows, monks, children, all decide to start walking to Jerusalem. But this isn't an army, not really. It's a stampede. Some of the earliest groups don't even wait for official organisation. They just leave. One of the first and most infamous bands is led by a man named Peter the Hermit, who, despite the name, is remarkably good at public speaking. He rides a donkey, carries a cross, and claims to have divine visions. Whether he actually believes his own sermons is unclear, but thousands follow him anyway. His so-called People's Crusade is less a military expedition and more a divine road trip powered by self-righteousness and no survival skills whatsoever. They leave Europe with no maps, no real weapons, and absolutely no idea what they're walking into. Within weeks, they're pillaging towns for food, starting fights with their hosts, and attacking Jewish communities in the Rhineland. Because apparently, some of them got the idea that killing any non-Christian counted toward their spiritual reward. These early mobs are a brutal foreshadowing of what's to come. They are slaughtered long before reaching Jerusalem. Most die in Anatolia, now modern-day Turkey, after annoying the Byzantine emperor and then charging blindly into a Turkish ambush. Peter the Hermit survives somehow, possibly by disappearing at the exact right moment. His followers are less lucky. Thousands of bodies rot in foreign soil, victims of their own zeal and their leaders' incompetence. But the real crusade, the one with the trained knights and sanctioned blessing of the church, is just getting started. Meanwhile, Europe's nobles are having a collective identity crisis. On one hand, they're lords and barons who've spent their lives fighting over castles and cows. On the other, they're now God's chosen warriors. The First Crusade quickly becomes a prestige project. Knights sell off land, leave behind wives, and empty their treasuries to outfit themselves for the journey. Some bring entire entourages, squires, cooks, translators, priests. Others just slap on a cross and hope for the best. A few of them genuinely believe in the cause. Most are hoping for plunder, land, or just an escape from their debts. It's a medieval gold rush dressed up as holy war. And so, across the continent, the roads fill with people wearing patched tunics, mismatched armour, and various expressions of self-importance. Crusading fever takes over. Blacksmiths work overtime, forging swords that will never strike anything but dirt. Priests bless banners with crosses that haven't seen a day of sunlight since being stitched in a wine-soaked tavern. Families gather in tears to send off sons who will, statistically, never return. The roads to the east become clogged with ox carts, mules and war horses. Hygiene is non-existent. Supplies are limited. Morale is high, but realism is very low. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, isn't thrilled when these crusader hordes start arriving. He'd asked for mercenaries, maybe a few hundred disciplined troops to reinforce his borders. What he gets is tens of thousands of dirty, hungry, overly enthusiastic Westerners who don't speak his language and have no idea how diplomacy works. Still, he does what he can. He ferries them across the Bosporus and hopes the Turks deal with them quickly. He's not wrong to worry. The Crusaders are about to barge into a region they don't understand, in a climate they're not prepared for, to fight an enemy they've never seen, all under the vague, emotionally loaded mission of liberating a city they can't even locate on a map. By the time the First Crusade officially kicks off in 1096, there's no turning back. It's a juggernaut of misplaced faith, imperial ambition, and sheer momentum. Nobody quite agrees on the strategy. Nobody has clear maps. The leaders distrust each other. The rank and file are hungry, sick, and already dying in the hundreds. But the Pope said God wanted this. And when God wants something, at least according to your local bishop, you keep marching, even if it kills you, which it will, repeatedly. It's tempting to picture the Crusades as a grand, coordinated march of righteous warriors guided by faith and strategy, a sort of divine military campaign with banners fluttering in the wind and everyone walking in lockstep toward the Holy Land. But the truth is that the Crusades, especially the first, were about as organised as a village-wide scavenger hunt, where half the participants are drunk, the other half are hallucinating, and nobody can agree on what the prize is. There was no singular commander-in-chief, no central war office, no master plan, supply chain, or even standard currency. What they had was a vague sense of divine purpose and an even vaguer idea of geography. The people who signed up for this were not, generally speaking, the intellectual cream of the medieval crop. Most were illiterate. Maps, if they existed at all, were not accurate depictions of physical space so much as theological diagrams with Jerusalem in the centre, surrounded by dragons, saints, and artistic guesses. If you asked a common crusader how far the journey would be, you'd get answers ranging from a few weeks to somewhere past Constantinople, probably. The Holy Land might as well have been a mythological realm, a place talked about in church but about as tangible as Atlantis. The average crusader couldn't tell you how many miles they had to walk, but they were certain it was worth it because someone in a robe said God would be pleased. Now technically, there were leaders. Several high-ranking nobles, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, among others, took it upon themselves to lead their own contingents. But each came with their own army, their own goals, and very little interest in cooperating. They were supposed to be co-commanders of a holy mission, but in practice they acted more like rival CEOs at a corporate retreat, where everyone's armed and sleep-deprived. Plans were discussed, sometimes even agreed upon, but then promptly ignored the moment someone saw a castle they liked or heard rumours of loot nearby. Coordination existed in theory. In practice, it collapsed the moment any actual marching began. Even the question of why they were doing this was deeply unsettled. Some believed they were liberating Christian lands. Others thought they were avenging Christ's death. Still others were just told they'd find gold, land, or at the very least, fewer taxes. The papal message was muddled. Urban II's original pitch at Clermont had been tailored to French nobility, emphasising holy duty and salvation. But as it spread across Europe, it morphed into 1,000 different interpretations. In some places, crusade preachers emphasised spiritual glory. In others, it was all about vengeance against Muslims. Some recruiters threw in promises of land and plunder to spice things up. The result was an ideological jambalaya. Some people thought they were going to fight. Some thought they were going to convert infidels. And some just thought it would be a fun road trip to where Jesus was born. The logistics, predictably, were a disaster. Medieval supply chains were fragile at the best of times. And this was not the best of times. Each lord was expected to provision his own troops, which worked about as well as you'd expect when crossing hundreds of miles through foreign territory. They relied on local foraging, looting, and the occasional deal with the locals, most of whom were not thrilled to see massive bands of heavily armed strangers show up asking for food, shelter, and allegiance. It's worth remembering that the people in the Eastern Mediterranean had been living under Islamic rule for centuries, and many Christians in those regions had made peace with that reality. To them, the Crusaders weren't saviours, they were armed fanatics on a continent-spanning bender. The Byzantines, who had reluctantly invited this chaos in the first place, quickly realised they'd made a catastrophic mistake. Emperor Alexios I had hoped for some professional troops, disciplined soldiers to reinforce his crumbling borders. Instead, he got waves of freelancing warlords dragging along camp followers, livestock, and their own mini-economies. Many crusader leaders swore oaths of loyalty to him, but those promises were more ceremonial than sincere. The Westerners viewed the Byzantines with suspicion, considering them effeminate, heretical, and way too into philosophy. The Byzantines, for their part, viewed the Crusaders as ignorant barbarians who smelled like raw onions and couldn't navigate their way out of a hallway. Neither side was wrong. The lack of leadership structure became painfully obvious during battles. There were no unified command centres, no consistent battle plans, and very few shared objectives. Often, entire contingents would wander off to do their own thing, sometimes failing to show up for major engagements because someone got distracted by a side quest involving a local fortress. Communication was slow, prone to misunderstanding, and frequently filtered through multiple layers of translation. You might have a French-speaking knight shouting orders to a German unit through a Greek interpreter who was relying on hand gestures and divine intervention to be understood. It was the military equivalent of playing a game of telephone with swords. Then there was the matter of discipline, or rather, the complete absence of it. Armies were supposed to be holy, but what actually travelled east was closer to a mobile riot. Soldiers got drunk, brawled with each other, assaulted civilians and routinely looted friendly villages. Clergy travelling with them tried to maintain some semblance of order, but it's difficult to preach repentance when everyone's bathing in wine stolen from a monastery. Even commanders struggled to control their own men. Knights were independent operators, beholden more to their own pride and honour than any central authority. The crusade as an entity was less an army than a migration of violence wrapped in religious rhetoric. And still, despite the infighting, the confusion, and the logistical collapse, the Crusaders kept moving. In part, it was momentum. Once thousands of people start walking in one direction, it's hard to stop them, especially when turning back means public shame, economic ruin, and possible eternal damnation. But there was also belief, sincere, strange, and often terrifying. Many truly believed they were doing God's work, that every hardship was a divine test, that every corpse they stepped over brought them 1 mile closer to paradise. The power of that belief, however ill-informed, was enough to keep them marching across hostile terrain, through disease-ridden camps, and into battles they had no business winning. In the end, the First Crusade's early years were defined by exactly this combination: fervent faith, abysmal planning, and a total lack of shared understanding. It wasn't just that nobody knew what they were doing, it's that they didn't agree on what doing it even meant. One man's holy war was another's land grab, another's pilgrimage, and another's drunken holiday. The only thing they had in common was a stitched-on cross and a collective delusion that God had personally RSVP'd their invitation to conquer the East. And so they marched, confused, chaotic, and convinced that destiny was just over the next hill. The first major hurdle of the crusade wasn't a battlefield. It was the simple, painful act of getting there. The journey to Jerusalem, some 2,000 miles on foot, began not with trumpets or divine signs, but with an endless series of poorly maintained roads, hostile villages, unpredictable terrain, and the slow, dawning realization that nobody packed nearly enough food. Crusaders didn't march into glory. They limped into it, blistered and lice-ridden, often dragging what was left of their dignity behind a donkey that would be dead by next Tuesday. Even by medieval standards, travel was miserable. Roads were barely more than muddy tracks worn into the earth by centuries of hooves, wheels, and regret. If it rained, they turned to sludge. If it didn't, they became choking clouds of dust. Bridges were rare, rickety, or guarded by toll collectors who saw a crusading army not as holy warriors, but as walking purses full of coins. Crossing a river could take days, and more than a few drowned under the weight of their own armour. Horses snapped legs, wagons lost wheels, people collapsed mid-step, often trampled by the throngs behind them. Then there was the problem of food, or rather, the lack of it. Most crusaders brought what they could carry, which wasn't much. Salted meat, dry bread, stale beer, enough to last a week, maybe 2, if rationed like a paranoid squirrel. But rations didn't last. People ate early, hoarded what they could, and once supplies ran out, they turned to begging, stealing, or outright looting. Entire towns were stripped bare within hours of a crusader army arriving. Fields were trampled, fences torn down for firewood. If a pig so much as squealed in the distance, it was dinner. Starvation wasn't a distant risk, it was a daily reality, especially once they reached more hostile territory. Disease flourished in this environment. Dysentery spread like gossip at a monastery. Fleas, lice, and ticks infested every layer of fabric. Latrines, when they existed, were shallow ditches that overflowed by morning. People drank from whatever water source they could find. Rivers, puddles, wells of questionable origin, often not realizing the water was poisoned, polluted, or full of decomposing remains from the last unlucky group to pass through. Dehydration set in not because there wasn't water, but because there wasn't drinkable water, and those who tried to boil their supply often lacked firewood, patience, or the basic understanding that boiling didn't mean holding the pot over a flame for 5 seconds. Weather was another enemy. Crusading through Europe meant crossing multiple climate zones with one outfit and no backup shoes. You might freeze to death in the Alps and then melt under the sun in Anatolia 3 weeks later. Spring rains turned camps into bogs. Summer heat cracked lips and sunburned scalps through dented helmets. Winter was an entirely different beast of frostbitten toes, snow-choked passes, and frozen supplies that had to be thawed with body heat before eating. Your tent, if you had one, was likely too small, poorly constructed, and shared with 4 other men who hadn't bathed since September. Hostile locals were less of a surprise and more of an inevitability. While Crusaders thought of themselves as holy emissaries, most villagers along the way just saw a violent mob. The passage of an army meant taxes, property damage, and possible death. Many towns resisted. Some barricaded their gates, others offered tributes in the hopes the army would move on. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Fighting broke out regularly, not between Crusaders and Muslims, but between Crusaders and the very people they were supposedly passing through peacefully, and that's assuming they didn't also turn on each other. Intra-Crusade violence was a common occurrence. Entire contingents got into fistfights over supplies, women, or simply who got to walk in the front. Petty nobles challenged each other to duels over imagined slights. Soldiers deserted in droves, some sneaking off in the night, others forming splinter bands to loot and burn whatever they could find. Banditry flourished, sometimes even within the ranks. One moment you're marching with a friendly group from Burgundy. The next, they've stolen your boots and vanished into the woods. The deeper into foreign territory they went, the more these small betrayals accumulated. Trust eroded, morale frayed. By the time they crossed into Anatolia, the Crusaders weren't a unified army. They were a fracturing swarm of feverish, paranoid, half-starved pilgrims with weapons and no map. Crossing into Asia Minor was its own special agony. The terrain was dry, mountainous, and unfamiliar. Food became scarcer, water even more dangerous. The Seljuk Turks controlled much of the territory, and they weren't interested in letting thousands of armed Europeans stroll through unchallenged. Skirmishes became constant. Supply caravans were ambushed. Scouts disappeared and reappeared in pieces. Every pass, every valley, every village became a potential trap. The Byzantines offered some help, sometimes food, sometimes guides, but they didn't trust the Crusaders any more than the Turks did. And given how Crusaders treated Byzantine villages, that mistrust was mutual. Marches across Anatolia turned into death parades. Horses dropped dead from exhaustion. Men collapsed from sunstroke. Armour was stripped off and discarded by the roadside, leaving trails of rusting helmets and splintered shields. Some tried to keep journals. The entries from this part of the journey tend to become incoherent. Long lists of names, prayers, and increasingly desperate pleas for God to just end it already. Entire battalions vanished, not to enemy blades, but to exposure and hunger. The path to the Holy Land was marked not by heroic victories, but by piles of unburied corpses and the buzzing of flies. By the time the remaining Crusaders approached the outskirts of Syria, their numbers had dwindled dramatically. Estimates vary, but some sources suggest that less than half of those who set out from Europe ever made it to the final leg of the journey. Many turned back. Others were captured, enslaved, or simply vanished into the wilderness. The ones who did survive were gaunt, hardened, and often spiritually unrecognizable from the wide-eyed pilgrims who had left home months or years before. Whatever faith they carried was buried under blisters, grief, and the stench of their own filth. And still somehow, they kept going. Because what else could they do? They had come too far to quit, and the promise of salvation, that golden, shining reward dangled by Pope Urban, was still just out of reach. Every step closer to Jerusalem made the suffering feel retroactively worthwhile, or at least bearable. The irony, of course, was that for many, the suffering was the point. Pain was purification. Endurance was devotion. Survival itself became a form of holiness. Not that it helped much, because the real nightmare was just beginning. By the time the Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in the summer of 1099, they weren't so much an army as they were a plague on legs. After years of marching, starving, infighting, and praying for divine room service that never arrived, the survivors were skeletal, sun-scorched, and spiritually exhausted. Some had buried friends, others had eaten their horses. A few had eaten, well, let's just say the meat on the menu wasn't always clearly labelled, but despite their physical ruin and psychological decay, they had made it. The holy city loomed ahead, sandstone walls glowing in the sun, palm trees swaying gently in the heat, and behind those walls, an entire civilian population going about their day with no idea what was about to hit them. The siege began with desperation. The Crusaders had no real siege equipment. They had very little food. Their water supply was tainted, and the surrounding countryside had been stripped bare by their own foraging parties. But they had one key resource in abundance: religious mania. The commanders tried to organise something resembling a strategy, cobbling together siege towers from whatever wood they hadn't already burned. They marched barefoot around the city, praying and fasting in a display of piety, as if hunger and heat stroke might summon divine demolition. Meanwhile, inside Jerusalem, the city's defenders, mostly Fatimid Muslims, prepared as best they could, reinforcing the walls and wondering if this entire army of starving lunatics might just collapse on its own. It didn't. Against all odds, and probably against God's better judgment, the Crusaders breached the walls in July. What followed wasn't a military victory, it was a slaughter. They poured into the city with swords drawn and theology firmly switched off. The accounts are grim, not in the poetic battlefield valor sense, but in the pure carnage and screaming sense. Women were stabbed while fleeing with children. Elderly men were hacked down in doorways. People were chased into synagogues and mosques, and then burned alive inside. Homes were looted, civilians dragged into the streets, and whole quarters of the city reduced to piles of blood-soaked rubble. Even monks and priests, people who had taken shelter in holy sites, were not spared. Sanctuaries were violated, altars desecrated. There was no distinction made between soldier and civilian, between combatant and child. Contemporary witnesses describe the streets literally running with blood. Some say it reached the ankles, others claim it rose to the knees, though this is likely poetic exaggeration, unless someone was crawling. Still, the sheer volume of death was staggering. Tens of thousands killed in the span of a few days. The Crusaders, high on adrenaline and years of repressed trauma, seemed to enter a kind of religious fugue state, one where every swing of a sword felt like a sacrament. Mercy was not just absent, it was actively discouraged. This wasn't about liberation, it was about purification through annihilation, and yet, through the gore, they saw this as holy. Knights reportedly knelt in blood-soaked armour, weeping in joy at the sight of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Prayers were offered, hymns were sung, crosses were raised, sometimes right next to smoking piles of human remains. This wasn't irony, this was doctrine. The people they killed weren't seen as victims. They were obstacles, heretics, infidels, enemies of God. The Crusaders had been promised salvation, and they believed they had earned it in full, one hacked limb at a time. What made the massacre especially appalling was its scale and indiscrimination. Muslims were the primary target, but Eastern Christians and Jews suffered just as terribly. Synagogues were locked and burned with worshippers still inside. Entire Christian families who had lived in Jerusalem for generations were mistaken for Muslims and murdered anyway. The Crusaders didn't know Arabic, didn't recognize the local Christian rites, and frankly didn't care. Anyone not wearing a European cross and speaking bad French was considered fair game. For a campaign supposedly waged in the name of Christ, the body count of fellow Christians was impressively high. After the killing slowed, it never really stopped, just tapered. The victors finally took stock of their conquest. Jerusalem was theirs. Sort of. What remained was a shattered, emptied city crawling with the stench of death. Bodies lay unburied. Wells were contaminated. The streets were silent, save for the sounds of scavenging and prayer. A new Christian kingdom was proclaimed, and Godfrey of Bouillon was named Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He refused the title king, claiming he wouldn't wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn one of thorns. Which was noble if you ignored the rivers of blood running past the church steps. With the city under their control, the Crusaders began awkwardly attempting governance. None of them spoke the local languages. They had no plan for civil administration. The local population had either fled, been slaughtered, or was now hiding under floorboards. They brought in clergy to try and establish a Latin Christian order, but it quickly became clear that ruling Jerusalem was going to be much harder than simply conquering it. They had won the city, yes, but they had destroyed nearly everything within it that made it function. The victory was Pyrrhic, holy in their minds, hollow in reality. Even the chroniclers, many of whom supported the Crusades, struggled to justify what had happened. Some framed it as divine vengeance, others were disturbingly gleeful, describing the massacre with a kind of reverent awe as if slaughter were a form of worship. A few quietly admitted the whole thing might have gone too far, but by then it was too late. The damage was done. Jerusalem, the goal of years of brutal marching and starvation, had been taken not with reverence, but with fire and blood, and the Crusaders, far from being cleansed by the experience, would carry the stain of that victory with them, whether they knew it or not. In the aftermath, messages were sent back to Europe. The city was taken. The mission was successful, and for a while the church rejoiced. Bells rang, masses were held, people cheered in cathedrals as if the world had somehow been made better. But on the ground in Jerusalem, there was no jubilation, just the slow rot of corpses in the sun and the quiet knowledge that what had been done in God's name could never be undone. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 wasn't the climactic, honourable, final battle of a noble pilgrimage. It was the final act in a long, confused campaign that had steadily unravelled into religious bloodlust. The Crusaders, after years of marching through hell and very nearly dying in Anatolia, had arrived outside the city, half mad with hunger, disease, and the kind of spiritual certainty that makes people very dangerous. They looked up at the fortified walls of Jerusalem, imagined all the sin and heresy allegedly lurking inside, and decided God would really appreciate it if they kicked the gates in and killed everyone. Jerusalem was not undefended. The city was held by the Fatimid Caliphate, with its own soldiers, citizens, and resources. But by the time the Crusaders arrived, it was hot. July in Palestine is not known for its gentle breezes, and everyone involved was already exhausted. The defenders were well positioned behind thick walls, and they had the advantage of elevation. The Crusaders, meanwhile, had almost nothing. Their siege equipment was crude and improvised, built from whatever timber could be scavenged or dismantled from nearby trees, homes, and the occasional unlucky olive grove. They had no clean water, no reliable food supply, and a growing number of men dying from diseases with names like probably dysentery and whatever's making Thomas bleed from the eyes. What they did have was desperation, and a burning sense that if they failed here, after all they'd endured, then it had all been for nothing. That kind of motivation is powerful, even when paired with sunstroke and rotting boots. The Crusader leadership, such as it was, rallied their forces and launched a full-scale assault on the city's walls. Siege towers were rolled into position. Ladders were raised. Arrows flew in both directions. Boiling oil and rocks were dumped on the invaders. Men screamed, died, and fell by the dozens. It was chaotic, disorganized, and fueled by more rage than strategy. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. A breach was made, not because of superior planning, but because the defenders couldn't hold every section of the wall at once. The Crusaders surged through with an energy that can only be described as religiously deranged. What followed was not a battle, it was a cleansing. That's how they saw it. A cleansing of infidels, unbelievers, and anyone unlucky enough to be on the wrong side of a sword. The streets filled with screams, civilians ran through alleyways, only to be cut down. Men and women were dragged from their homes, children were speared or trampled. Elderly priests were thrown from rooftops. There was no mercy, no discrimination, and no tactical logic. This wasn't war, it was carnage. Muslim defenders were executed en masse. Jewish families were herded into synagogues and burned alive inside them. Even Eastern Christians, those native to Jerusalem, who had lived there peacefully for generations, were slaughtered in the confusion, mistaken for enemies or simply caught in the frenzy. Monks were cut down as they clutched crucifixes. Mothers were butchered holding infants. People died where they stood, slept, or prayed. It didn't matter. If you weren't wearing a Crusader cross, your odds of survival were slim to none. Eyewitnesses and chroniclers give gruesome accounts. Some claimed that blood ran ankle-deep through the streets. Others said it splashed against the knees of horses. These measurements may be metaphorical, but they reflect the reality of what happened, an orgy of death unlike anything Jerusalem had seen in centuries. Corpses clogged doorways. Alleyways turned into rivers of rot. The air reeked of sweat, blood, smoke, and whatever else gets released when 1,000 people die in the same afternoon. The city groaned beneath it. It didn't fall, it hemorrhaged. And yet to the Crusaders, this was divine validation. They had suffered, and now they had conquered. They didn't see slaughter, they saw salvation. Many knelt in the blood-stained streets to pray, thanking God for victory as the bodies cooled around them. They sang hymns beside the ruins they had created, marched barefoot to holy sites they'd just defiled, and raised crosses above piles of still steaming corpses. The church of the Holy Sepulchre was cleaned and rededicated, just steps from where unarmed civilians had been butchered in the name of Christ. This was, they believed, the moment of fulfillment. They had reached the spiritual endgame, and all it had cost was tens of thousands of lives. The leaders of the crusade treated the victory as sacred. Godfrey of Bouillon refused the title of King of Jerusalem, claiming he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn thorns. A poetic gesture, perhaps, but it didn't stop him from ruling the city with force. Jerusalem was now a Christian city, Latin Christian specifically, and the remnants of its previous communities were either dead, exiled, or quietly praying that someone would realise what had just happened and do something about it. For those still alive, the aftermath was no less horrifying. Bodies were left unburied for days in the blistering heat. Disease spread quickly through what was left of the Crusader camp and the shell-shocked city. Water was scarce. The few residents who hadn't fled were forced to clean up the ruins of their own neighbourhoods. Animals roamed freely through rubble. Flies darkened the walls of buildings that hadn't already been burned. The air hung heavy with the smell of rot, and something darker, the weight of what happens when humans convince themselves that murder is sacred. And yet this horror show was celebrated back in Europe. News travelled slowly, but when it reached the cathedrals and courts of France, Italy, and Germany, it was framed as a miraculous triumph. God had granted victory. The Holy Land was restored to Christian hands. No mention was made of what that restoration actually looked like. The sermons didn't include the screaming, or the burning, or the ankle-deep blood. The Pope praised the outcome. So did bishops, lords, and even poets. The Crusaders were heroes now, saviours, instruments of divine justice. But to everyone else, Muslims, Jews, Eastern Christians, and even a few quietly disturbed Latin observers, it was a catastrophe. A city had been torn open like a wound, its people shredded, its holy sites bathed in the very blood they were supposed to sanctify. The so-called defenders of the faith had arrived not with open arms, but with torches and swords. And as the dust settled, as the Crusaders began to stake out new homes and territories in a land they barely understood, it became clear that this wasn't the end of something. It was just the start. Because if this was what victory looked like, what would defeat feel like? So, Jerusalem is conquered. The walls are breached. The city's been liberated in a bloodbath. And the Crusaders now control the most contested pile of bricks in the medieval world. One might expect a moment of rest, maybe celebration, perhaps a return to something resembling normalcy. But no, this is still the Crusades, and if the slaughter didn't kill you, the aftermath was more than happy to try. Because taking Jerusalem, as it turns out, was the easy part. Holding it, surviving it, that's where things get grim. The first problem was that the Crusaders had absolutely no idea what to do next. They had spent years marching east, driven by sermons and suffering, only to arrive at a destination they had mythologized into something far more glorious than reality could ever support. Now they were standing in the ruins of a city they had just depopulated, looking around for guidance and realizing there was none. Most of them weren't administrators. They were knights, squires, and foot soldiers, experts in breaking things, not building them. And what they found, once the adrenaline wore off, was that Jerusalem was not some divine paradise. It was a barely functioning, disease-ridden husk. Food was the most immediate concern. The Crusaders had looted what they could during the siege, but supplies ran out fast. There were no shipment lines, no stocked granaries, and no backup plan. The local agricultural system had been devastated by years of warfare, and the surrounding countryside wasn't exactly eager to hand over their grain to a bunch of foreign killers. Famine set in within weeks. Bread was scarce, meat non-existent, and water dangerously unreliable. People began boiling roots, chewing leather, and eating whatever they could find, including rats, weeds, and, in some accounts, parts of horses that had been dead a little too long. Water wasn't much better. Wells had been fouled during the siege, and the few remaining sources were quickly contaminated by human waste, rotting corpses, or both. Diarrhea became a near-universal condition. Dysentery, the medieval travel companion no one asked for, swept through the population. People died sitting in ditches, unable to keep food or water down. Wounds from battle festered. Infections spread unchecked. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, and very few medics who actually understood what a germ was. If you got a cut on your leg, you might survive. Or it might swell, turn black, and kill you 3 days later in a puddle of your own blood and bile. Then there was the heat. The sun over Jerusalem didn't care about your divine mission. It beat down on the Crusaders relentlessly, baking them in their rusting armour and leather boots. Shade was scarce. Most slept on the ground or in the ruins of burned-out homes, surrounded by flies and the stench of decay. Clothing quickly became infested. Lice were everywhere, in hair, in beards, in the folds of skin under rusted mail. Itching was constant. Rashes turned into sores. Eyebrows became tiny ecosystems of parasites and grime. The smell, by all accounts, was indescribable. One chronicler politely referred to it as pungent. Others were less kind. And yet hygiene remained a theological afterthought. Bathing was seen with suspicion, a potential vanity, or worse, a sin. Some crusaders hadn't washed in years. Others had never learned how. The few who tried were often limited by the lack of clean water. Soap was rare. Communal baths were almost unheard of. And the ones that did exist were more likely to spread disease than prevent it. Clothing was worn until it rotted off or caught fire. Bedding was straw, if you were lucky, or the ground if you weren't. Fleas, mites, and bedbugs thrived. Morale collapsed quickly. Whatever spiritual high had accompanied the liberation of Jerusalem had long since drained away, replaced by exhaustion and confusion. Crusaders had come expecting miracles and eternal glory. Instead, they found bureaucracy, starvation, and a lot of angry locals. Fights broke out. Commanders clashed over territory and titles. Godfrey of Bouillon tried to establish order, but power struggles flared as quickly as they were settled. Some crusaders wanted to stay and help build a kingdom. Others wanted to leave immediately, fearing they'd be killed if they stuck around. There was no unified plan, just arguments and slowly decomposing ambition. The locals, unsurprisingly, were not thrilled by their new overlords. Many had fled the city before the siege, but some had stayed or returned later. Christian and Muslim families who hoped to rebuild or at least survive. They were met with suspicion, harassment, and occasional violence. Crusaders viewed them as either heretics or inconvenient reminders that this land wasn't actually empty. Language barriers made everything worse. Trade was minimal. Tensions simmered. The so-called Kingdom of Jerusalem was looking more like a squatter camp with delusions of grandeur, and still the deaths continued. Some died from wounds they'd carried all the way from Anatolia. Others succumbed to infections. Some simply collapsed from heat stroke and never got up. A few wandered into the countryside in search of food and were never seen again. Whether they were killed by locals, animals, or starvation is anyone's guess. Crusader cemeteries filled rapidly. There weren't enough priests to give proper burials. Bodies were often left in shallow graves or simply burned. The smell of rot hung over the city, like a cloud no prayer could disperse. It was, in every sense, a slow-motion unravelling. The Crusaders had won the battle, but the city was broken. The people were dying, and the so-called victory felt less like triumph and more like terminal illness. For the average Crusader, the low-ranking soldier or devout pilgrim, life in the Holy Land had become a waking purgatory. You couldn't leave easily. You couldn't eat reliably. You couldn't pray the plague away. And every night, as you lay on lice-ridden cloth next to the groaning sick, you might have started to wonder, had you misunderstood God's will? Because for all the promises of glory and salvation, the reality was far more medieval, in every sense of the word. Starving, itching, dying, this was your reward. And Jerusalem, that sacred beacon at the end of the world, was now little more than a hot, stinking ruin where the faithful came to rot. Imagine waking up one morning in your quiet Jerusalem neighbourhood. Maybe you're a Muslim merchant, a Jewish teacher, or a Christian monk, and hearing that tens of thousands of angry, sunburned Europeans are marching your way with swords, banners, and absolutely no sense of who you are. Not because of anything you did, not because of politics or trade or even regional warfare. No, they're coming because some man in a pointed hat halfway across the continent said that your city belonged to them. Because of a centuries-old theological grievance, because someone translated Holy Land as ours by default, because of a speech in France. For the people already living in Jerusalem and the surrounding regions, the Crusades weren't some glorious religious mission. They were a terrifying, confusing invasion. The Holy Land was not empty. It wasn't some lost Christian theme park waiting to be reclaimed. It was a densely populated, multicultural region filled with people who lived, worked, worshipped, and died there, many of whom had done so for generations. Muslims, Jews, and various branches of Eastern Christianity all coexisted in a complicated but generally tolerable equilibrium. Religious diversity wasn't just a fact of life, it was baked into the landscape. Then the Crusaders arrived and everything fell apart. To the local Muslim population, the arrival of the Crusaders was an apocalyptic event. Most of them had no idea who these Europeans were or why they were coming. The idea that Christians from the far west would suddenly descend upon their cities with the stated goal of reclaiming Jerusalem for Christ made about as much sense as if a group of Icelandic warlords had landed in Florida claiming it used to be sacred Viking land. The Crusaders didn't speak Arabic, didn't know the regional politics, and didn't care. They saw the entire region as a kind of religious board game. And Muslims, regardless of their actual affiliations, beliefs or actions, were all labelled as enemies of God. This led to predictable outcomes. Muslim families fled in droves. Those who stayed were often slaughtered or enslaved. Mosques were looted, libraries were burned, scholars were executed, entire neighbourhoods were razed. It wasn't just military conquest, it was cultural erasure. The Crusaders weren't there to negotiate or learn, they were there to conquer and purify, terms that in this context meant destroy everything that isn't Latin Christian. Muslim residents, many of whom had lived peacefully under a variety of rulers for centuries, suddenly found themselves cast as villains in someone else's end times fantasy. And it wasn't just Muslims. Jewish communities suffered horrifically during the Crusades, not just in Jerusalem, but all along the route. In Europe, entire Jewish populations were massacred by Crusader mobs before they even reached the Holy Land. And once the Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem, the pattern continued. Jews who had lived in the city for centuries were rounded up, forced into synagogues, and burned alive. Their homes were looted, their children murdered, their presence erased. There was no logic to it, no military necessity, just blind hatred cloaked in divine justification. The Crusaders didn't distinguish between enemy combatant and person who worships differently. They didn't have the vocabulary for that kind of nuance. Even Eastern Christians, who in theory should have been spared, weren't safe. These were not Catholics. They were Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Syriac, Coptic. To the Crusaders, these subtle theological differences were enough to inspire suspicion and violence. Local Christians were often mistaken for Muslims, especially if they spoke Arabic or wore non-Western clothing. Some were killed by accident, others were killed on purpose as a warning or just because they were in the way. The Crusaders had come to reclaim the city for Christianity, but what they really meant was their Christianity, the Latin, Western, papal kind. Anything else was suspect at best, heretical at worst. From the local perspective then, the Crusades were not a liberation. They were a catastrophe, a sudden violent invasion by religious fundamentalists with bad hygiene and no understanding of the region they were trying to save. The Crusaders brought not peace or unity, but chaos. They toppled long-standing systems of governance, destroyed cultural institutions, and replaced them with a volatile patchwork of feudal rule and military occupation. And all the while, they acted as if they were restoring something noble, as if their presence was a gift. To add insult to injury, they treated the entire region like a live-action Bible set. Crusaders were known to wander the countryside, looking for places where Jesus might have stood. They argued over relics, declared random hills to be holy sites, and renamed towns to match their scriptural imaginations. Local traditions were dismissed or overwritten. Sacred places were repurposed, often violently. If you lived there, if this was your home, your land, your family's burial ground, you were now expected to treat it as someone else's prophecy playground. The psychological damage was profound. Families displaced, communities shattered. entire generations raised in the shadow of foreign rule and religious hostility. The Crusaders didn't just take cities, they took stability, identity, and trust. Every interaction was clouded by fear. Every new edict was another reminder that your life was subject to the whims of people who couldn't pronounce your name, let alone understand your faith. And through it all, the rhetoric of divine purpose never stopped. The Crusaders believed they were instruments of God. That belief made them unstoppable. It also made them terrifying. For the locals, survival became an act of resistance. Some fled to neighbouring regions, others stayed and tried to rebuild, forming uneasy relationships with the new rulers. Trade networks were slowly re-established. New alliances were formed, but the memory lingered. The violence wasn't a passing storm. It was a generation-defining trauma. People remembered the day the sky turned red, the day the churches burned, the day strangers arrived and told them that their God was wrong, their lives were forfeit, and their future belonged to someone else's vision of righteousness. In the Crusader Chronicles, these people barely appear. When they do, they're often just obstacles. The Saracens, the infidels, the enemy. They aren't people, they're theological set dressing. But in reality, they were mothers, scribes, merchants, midwives. They were teachers, craftsmen, children, and they watched helpless as everything around them was torn apart in the name of a God who, if he was watching, must have wept. Just when you thought the Crusades couldn't get more tragic, confusing, or ethically questionable, along comes a moment of such spectacular absurdity that even medieval chroniclers had to squint at their ink and ask, wait, did that really happen? This is the Children's Crusade, a historical event so poorly documented and so riddled with contradictory sources that it exists in a hazy fog of legend, propaganda, and mass delusion. And yet something happened. Enough was recorded, enough rumours, enough testimonies, enough bodies left behind, to suggest that yes, at some point in the early 13th century, someone decided that if sending thousands of angry adult men to the Holy Land didn't work, maybe it was time to try children. Depending on which version of the story you read, the Children's Crusade began in either France or Germany, around the year 1212. In one telling, a boy named Stephen of Cloyes, aged 12, claimed he received a letter from Jesus instructing him to lead a crusade. Not a symbolic crusade, a real one. Marching to Jerusalem, converting Muslims through peace and divine purity, and reclaiming the city without violence, because children, apparently, were just that holy. In another version, a German boy named Nicholas rallied a following with the same promise, that if children journeyed east, the seas would part for them, miracles would guide them, and God would deliver Jerusalem into their tiny, calloused hands. Both stories involve charismatic preteens, visions, and an unsettling number of adults who failed to intervene. These weren't just 10 or 20 kids running through the woods. Thousands joined. Some were barely walking age, others were adolescents escaping poverty, abuse, or simply boredom. Many were orphans. Some came with their parents, others came with absolutely no plan whatsoever, other than Jerusalem is that way. And incredibly, no one stopped them. The clergy didn't intervene. Local officials mostly just watched. A few even encouraged it. Because when the grown-ups are burning heretics and calling it salvation, why wouldn't the children think a walk to the Holy Land was the next logical step? To be clear, these weren't soldiers. They weren't trained, armed, or prepared. Most had never left their villages. They didn't know how far Jerusalem actually was. A consistent theme, it seems, in crusade planning. Many didn't even make it past their first 100 miles. Hunger and fatigue set in quickly. Disease followed. Some were robbed by bandits. Others were helped by locals who then stole everything they had. The roads were unkind, so were the weather and the wolves. Those who did survive the initial leg of the journey often ended up begging at city gates, hoping for bread or shelter. Some towns fed them, some locked the gates. A few tried to absorb them into orphanages or labour pools. But the dream of reaching Jerusalem, that persistent, glowing fantasy of divine destiny, kept many of them walking. According to some accounts, a group of the French children made it all the way to the port cities of Marseille. There they believed ships would appear, sent by God to carry them across the sea. And, as if by miracle, ships did appear, offered by two merchants who, depending on the telling, were either devout Christians or opportunistic human traffickers. The children boarded, the ships sailed, and they were never seen again. Later reports claimed that at least 2 of the vessels were lost in storms. The rest docked in North Africa, where the passengers were sold into slavery. Some ended up in brothels, others in mines. A few were rumoured to survive long enough to write letters home, begging for rescue that never came. The German version fared no better. Nicholas led his group across the Alps, yes, the Alps, believing that if they just kept going, God would clear the way. He did not. Hundreds died in the mountains. Those who survived eventually reached Italy, where they were met not with divine intervention, but with bureaucracy and indifference. The Pope received them. He wept, he prayed, and then he sent most of them home, assuming they lived long enough to make the return journey. Many didn't. Disease, hunger, exposure, all finished what the sea hadn't. Now, to be fair, some historians believe the term Children's Crusade may be a mislabeling. The Latin word pueri, often used in the original sources, could mean children, but it could also mean the poor or unmarried. Some think the participants were mostly impoverished young adults, not toddlers with toy swords. Others argue that the stories were exaggerated or mythologized by later chroniclers, trying to frame the event as a moral fable. And yet, even under the most generous interpretations, the reality remains bleak. Whether they were children, adolescents, or just desperate peasants, they were untrained, unarmed, and unprepared, swept up in a movement that promised redemption but delivered only suffering. The Children's Crusade, then, is less about actual strategy and more about mood. It captures the emotional and spiritual exhaustion of a Europe that had spent over a century hurling armies toward the Holy Land with no lasting success. It reflects a growing desperation, a belief that perhaps innocence, rather than strength, was the missing ingredient. That if you just stripped away the violence and the politics and the ambition, maybe God would finally say, yes, this is the one. That belief was naive. It was beautiful, in a heartbreaking way, and it got thousands of people killed. In many ways, the Children's Crusade was the logical endpoint of crusade ideology. If you convince generations that martyrdom is noble, that salvation is geographic, and that death is a gateway to glory, it's only a matter of time before the children start marching. Not because they understand, but because they believe. Because belief is powerful. It moves mountains. It also gets people sold into slavery in Tunis. And perhaps the most tragic part is how easily it was forgotten. The participants disappeared. The records are vague. The survivors, if there were any, left little trace. The whole thing faded into fable, a cautionary tale, a footnote in sermons, an anecdote trotted out to warn against excessive piety or poor planning. No monuments were built, no apologies were issued, and the Holy Land remained, as ever, unconquered in spirit, unmoved by innocence, and very much still under dispute. After the blood had soaked into the streets of Jerusalem, and the bodies had been cleared, mostly, the surviving crusaders found themselves in the awkward position of having to run the place. It turns out that conquering a city was only the beginning of their problems. Now they had to govern it, and not just Jerusalem either. Emboldened by their improbable victory, the crusaders spread out across the Levant like overconfident tourists with swords, carving up the region into a series of makeshift kingdoms, counties and principalities. They called them the Crusader states, but a more accurate term might be armed real estate experiments conducted by sunburned warlords with no exit strategy. The four major Crusader states were the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. These were not smooth functional realms. They were barely held together by charisma, intimidation, and a few lines scribbled on parchment by European lords who didn't understand the geography, the culture, or even how many enemies they had just made. Local terrain was ignored in favour of dramatic castle locations. Tribal alliances were overlooked in favour of convenient borders. Language barriers were treated as a minor inconvenience, as if shouting louder in French would eventually make Arabic speakers understand tax collection. At the heart of it all was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which sounds majestic but was mostly a patchy network of fortified towns, feuding nobles and roads that were either sand or bandit territory. The kingdom never extended more than a few hundred miles at its greatest extent, and much of that was contested by various Muslim rulers, Bedouin tribes, or simply nature itself. Even within Crusader territory, control was fragile. Every castle was essentially a panic room with a flag. Every noble lived in constant fear of rebellion, invasion, or assassination. The roads between cities were often unsafe, patrolled by raiders and disgruntled locals. Trade caravans were risky, pilgrims were ambushed. Peace was a temporary illusion between sieges. The Europeans tried to impose their feudal systems on the region, but it was like planting tomatoes in a desert and wondering why nothing grew. Titles like Count and Baron were handed out freely, but they meant little to the locals who didn't care about European aristocracy and weren't thrilled about paying taxes to men who couldn't pronounce their names. The Crusaders, in turn, saw the local population as suspicious at best and heretical at worst. Relations with the indigenous Christians, Armenians, Syriacs, Maronites, were strained. Relations with Muslims and Jews were worse. The Crusader ruling class remained an insular elite, clinging to power through force and occasional marriage alliances that almost never worked out. Cultural integration was not a high priority. Most Crusaders treated the Levant as a temporary occupation, not a homeland. They brought their own customs, their own laws, and their own food preferences, often insisting on wine and pork in a region where both were scarce or offensive. Few bothered to learn Arabic or understand Islamic legal codes. Instead, they built Latin churches, minted their own coins, and imported European clergy to minister to a population that largely didn't want them. Local elites were pushed out. Entire religious communities were sidelined. What could have been an opportunity for cultural fusion became, predictably, a simmering resentment stew. Infighting among the Crusaders themselves didn't help. The various lords who carved out their little chunks of territory had wildly different personalities, priorities, and grudges. Alliances were made and broken faster than treaties could be signed. Nobles fought over who should marry whom, who controlled which castle, and whether or not God liked them more. Succession crises were constant. Sometimes they were settled by diplomacy. More often they were settled by poisoned daggers or awkward accidents involving staircases. The ruling class was so preoccupied with their petty rivalries that they frequently ignored external threats until it was too late. Which brings us to the Muslim world. The Islamic empires in the region, fragmented though they were, had not taken the Crusader presence lightly. While internal divisions slowed their response at first, over time, resistance solidified. Leaders like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and eventually Saladin began organising coherent military responses. They saw the Crusader states not as permanent features, but as foreign tumours to be removed. And from their perspective, The Crusaders made it easy. The Europeans were arrogant, disorganized, and utterly dependent on reinforcements from Europe, which came sporadically and often with their own agenda. Siege after siege followed. Cities were lost and retaken. Castles changed hands like poker chips in a game. No one was winning. The Crusader states became islands of foreign rule surrounded by hostile seas. Defending them required constant vigilance, endless money, and a steady supply of troops that were increasingly hard to come by. Europe's enthusiasm for crusading had started to wane. The First Crusade had been a holy firestorm. By the time of the later reinforcements, most expeditions were either underfunded, overhyped, or disastrously mismanaged. Some crusades never even made it to the Holy Land. Others arrived too late, or ended up attacking the wrong targets altogether. The Crusader states, once hailed as footholds of Christian civilization, became liabilities, expensive, vulnerable, and deeply unpopular with almost everyone nearby. Economically, the Crusader states were shaky at best. They relied heavily on trade, especially with Italian merchant cities like Venice and Genoa, who saw an opportunity and took full advantage of it. In exchange for naval support and supplies, these merchants were granted special privileges, trading posts, tax exemptions, and sometimes entire quarters of cities. This created a new layer of tension as native populations watched their own economies be undercut by foreign traders backed by foreign knights who lived in foreign castles. The states were slowly becoming colonial outposts run by absentee landlords and greedy middlemen. Militarily, they were stretched thin. Defence required garrisons in every major city and fort, along with the constant maintenance of walls, weapons, and bribes. Armies had to be raised, fed, and paid, often with money that didn't exist. When a city was lost, it took years to recover. When a castle fell, it often took everything with it. And always in the background was the looming threat of a unified Muslim force sweeping through the region like a tidal wave. Eventually, that would happen. But long before that final collapse, the Crusader states were already decaying from within. By the 13th century, it was clear to most observers, both inside and outside the region, that the Crusader experiment was failing. The land they had claimed as a divine inheritance had become a graveyard for their ambitions. Locals despised them. Their European backers had grown weary. Their leaders were either dead, exiled, or too busy stabbing each other in the back to notice the noose tightening around them. These weren't kingdoms, they were armed outposts waiting to fall. In the end, the Crusader states weren't remembered for their justice or culture or governance. They were remembered for their arrogance, their violence, and their staggering inability to adapt. They came as saviours. They left as a cautionary tale, and in between they burned a lot of bridges, both literal and metaphorical. Welcome to medieval colonialism. Sand in your boots, blood on your hands, and absolutely no contingency plan. If the First Crusade was a brutal miracle, succeeding largely through confusion, violence, and divine luck, then what followed was an increasingly embarrassing sequel franchise that should have ended with the original. But it didn't, because when religion, pride, and political ambition mix, you don't get restraint, you get a franchise. And so, Europe kept sending more expeditions eastward, each one more ambitious, more disorganized, and somehow more catastrophic than the last. Welcome to the Second, Third, and Fourth Crusades, a trilogy of flops, featuring battlefield blunders, missed opportunities, and a spectacular finale where the Crusaders forgot who the enemy was and burned down the world's most important Christian city instead. Let's begin with the Second Crusade, launched in 1147. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was holding on by its cracked fingernails, and the county of Edessa, one of the Crusader states, had just fallen to the Muslim ruler Zengi. This was, predictably, taken as a divine insult that required immediate response. Enter two European monarchs, King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of the Holy Roman Empire. Both were powerful men. Neither had any military sense east of the Rhine. They brought large armies, marched off with fanfare, and almost immediately began making mistakes. The route through Anatolia, the same one the first Crusaders had bled over, hadn't improved. Disease, heat, and Turkish ambushes whittled down their forces before they even saw the Holy Land. By the time they arrived, their armies were in shambles, morale was somewhere beneath sea level, and nobody could agree on what the crusade was even supposed to do. Eventually, they chose to attack Damascus, a city that was technically Muslim but had been friendly with the Crusader states. Bold move. Within days, the siege collapsed. Everyone went home. No territory was gained. No cities were liberated. The only real accomplishment was confirming that you could, in fact, spend millions of medieval coins and thousands of lives achieving absolutely nothing. But the crusade that people actually remember, and sometimes even romanticize, is the Third Crusade, launched in 1189. This one had all the ingredients for a medieval blockbuster: famous kings, legendary battles, and a charismatic villain. The cause? Jerusalem had fallen again, this time to Saladin, the Kurdish Muslim sultan who had united much of the Islamic world and done something few others had managed: defeat the Crusaders decisively. After crushing their army at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, he retook the city with far less bloodshed than his predecessors. This was unacceptable to Europe, which saw it as a spiritual disaster. Cue the biggest names of the age: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. 3 kings, 1 goal. You'd think that would inspire unity. It didn't. Barbarossa drowned en route. Yes, drowned. While crossing a river in Anatolia, and most of his army went home. Philip and Richard made it to the Holy Land, but immediately started arguing. Richard was bold, brash, and very good at killing people. Philip was tired, sick, and left early. Richard remained, launching daring assaults and retaking some coastal cities, including Acre. But despite his military success, he never took Jerusalem. He marched toward it, looked at the numbers, and realized he couldn't hold it even if he won. So he signed a truce with Saladin instead. Pilgrims would be allowed access to Jerusalem. The Crusader states would hold a narrow strip of land. Everyone else would try again later. Richard went home a hero. The Holy Land remained in Muslim hands. The Third Crusade had plenty of drama, but in the end, it was a draw. A bloody, expensive, strategically ambiguous draw. Which brings us inevitably to the Fourth Crusade. Proof that if you let this series run long enough, it turns into a surrealist farce. Launched in 1202, this crusade was supposed to attack Egypt, which had become the new base of Muslim power in the region. The plan made sense, at least on paper. Egypt was vulnerable, wealthy, and strategically crucial. But then the Crusaders ran into a common medieval problem: money. They didn't have enough. They had contracted with Venice for ships, and Venice, being a city of calculating merchants, expected payment in full. When the money didn't appear, the Venetians made an offer. Help us conquer the Christian city of Zara, a rival port on the Dalmatian coast, and we'll call it even. The Pope explicitly forbade this. The Crusaders did it anyway. They sacked Zara, a Catholic city, looted it, and continued on, having now committed war crimes before even leaving Europe. The Pope excommunicated everyone involved. It was not an auspicious start. Then, because things weren't messy enough, a Byzantine prince approached the Crusaders with an offer: help him reclaim the throne of Constantinople, and he'd fund the rest of their journey to Egypt. Constantinople, in case you forgot, was the capital of the Eastern Orthodox Church, a Christian stronghold that had been a reluctant ally during earlier Crusades. But the prince had a good pitch. Money, supplies, troops. The Crusaders agreed. The initial attempt to install him went poorly. Riots broke out. He failed to pay up. So the Crusaders, in a fit of righteous irritation, sacked Constantinople instead. This was not a small incident. Constantinople was one of the most sophisticated cities in the medieval world, full of libraries, churches, palaces, and priceless works of art. The Crusaders tore through it like a pack of wolves let loose in a museum. They looted relics, defiled sanctuaries, and set fires that burned for days. Priests were killed. Nuns were raped. The city was stripped of its treasures, and the Byzantine Empire was left shattered, all by men who, on paper, had set out to save Jerusalem. They never made it there. They got distracted, and they destroyed the greatest Christian city in the East instead. The Fourth Crusade marked a turning point. Whatever spiritual veneer the Crusades had clung to was now peeling off in chunks. Even in Europe, people began to question what exactly all this was for. The Holy Land was still in Muslim hands. The Crusader states were crumbling. And now the Crusaders were killing Christians with more enthusiasm than they'd ever shown fighting anyone else. The papacy tried to spin it. Some people still believed, but a creeping cynicism had set in. The Crusades were no longer about salvation. They were about power, loot, and ambition, masquerading as holiness. And there were still more Crusades to come, increasingly desperate, increasingly incoherent. But by the end of the Fourth, one thing was clear. Whatever divine mission had once existed, it had been buried under gold, blood, and the rubble of a city that should never have been touched. This wasn't a war for God. It was a medieval identity crisis, in full armour, trampling everything in its path, including itself. By the time the Fourth Crusade rolled around, the whole operation had already taken a detour through absurdity. What began as a divine military expedition to reclaim the Holy Land had somehow devolved into a poorly funded pirate cruise with religious overtones. No one expected it to be clean, but even by the increasingly flexible standards of medieval holy war, what happened in 1204 was a theological facepalm of staggering proportions. The Crusaders, fresh off disobeying the Pope by attacking a Christian port city, turned their eyes toward a much shinier, richer, and even more Christian target, Constantinople. This was not some random village or poorly defended town. Constantinople was the jewel of the Eastern Mediterranean, a massive ancient metropolis filled with art, libraries, monasteries, palaces, and enough gold leaf iconography to blind a bishop. It had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire for centuries. It was the heart of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. It was also, unfortunately, in the middle of a messy dynastic dispute. And nothing draws in Western opportunists quite like a power vacuum with shiny buildings nearby. The spark for the disaster came from a Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos. His father had been deposed and blinded, standard Byzantine retirement package, and young Alexios fled to the west in search of help. He found the Crusaders, who were at that point broke, stranded in Zara and not particularly interested in Egypt anymore. Alexios made them a simple offer. Help me reclaim the throne, and I'll pay you. A lot. In cash, soldiers, supplies, everything you need to finish your crusade. It sounded like a miracle. And, like most miracles promised by exiled royalty, it turned out to be mostly wishful thinking. The Crusaders agreed, of course. They had debts to pay, an armour to clean, and Constantinople looked very inviting from across the water. The Venetians, who were providing the fleet, were especially interested in opening up trade routes and knocking down a rival. So in 1203, the Crusaders sailed to Constantinople, not to attack, they claimed, but to restore the rightful emperor. They laid siege to the city, set fires in the suburbs, and eventually forced the current emperor to flee. Alexios IV was installed alongside his blind father as co-emperor, and the Crusaders waited to be paid, which is where the problems began. Alexios didn't have the money. He thought he did. He thought he could squeeze it out of the Byzantine treasury or raise it through taxes. But the Byzantine court didn't take kindly to a puppet emperor who owed his throne to heavily armed Latins camped outside the palace. Resistance grew. Riots broke out. The church in Constantinople, the Eastern Orthodox Patriarchate, denounced the Westerners as heretics. And within a year, Alexios had been overthrown and strangled in a palace coup. The Crusaders, still unpaid, still cold, and increasingly annoyed, decided to respond the only way they knew how, with fire. In April 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, not in battle, not in defence, but as a deliberate act of plunder. They stormed the gates, overwhelmed the guards, and proceeded to tear through the city like starving wolves. What followed was not a raid. It was a cultural and spiritual catastrophe. Churches were looted, icons shattered, and relics stolen by the cartload. The Hagia Sophia, one of the most sacred sites in Christendom, was desecrated. A prostitute was said to have danced mockingly on the altar, while drunken soldiers cheered and looted chalices. Saints' bones were taken, gospel manuscripts were torn up, gold mosaics were peeled from walls and melted down. The city burned for days, entire districts went up in smoke, centuries-old libraries were reduced to ash. Monasteries were emptied, their contents scattered or sold. Residents were slaughtered or raped. Nuns were dragged from convents and violated in the streets. Artifacts that had survived barbarian invasions and earthquakes were now crushed underfoot by men who believed they were doing God's work. And all of this was carried out by Christians, against other Christians, in a city that had, at least until recently, been their ally. The spoils were staggering. Phoenician ships were filled with treasures, golden chalices, ivory carvings, embroidered banners, and relics that would be paraded in European cathedrals for centuries to come. The Crusaders distributed loot among themselves, set up a Latin empire in the city, and crowned Baldwin of Flanders as their new emperor. It was, by all appearances, a successful conquest. A Christian capital had been taken, a Latin monarch installed, and Europe, at least briefly, cheered. But the long-term consequences were disastrous. The Eastern Orthodox Church never forgot what happened. The schism between East and West, already growing since 1054, now hardened into something far worse than a doctrinal disagreement. It became bitterness, distrust, hatred. The memory of the sack of Constantinople would linger in Orthodox minds for centuries, fueling resentment that continues to echo in religious and cultural tensions to this day. To them, the Crusaders weren't holy warriors. They were violent looters in cross-shaped armour, desecrating sacred ground in the name of a distorted foreign faith. Even in the West, reactions were mixed. Some praised the victory, others were horrified. Pope Innocent III, who had excommunicated the Crusaders after the attack on Zara, now found himself in the awkward position of having to decide whether to denounce the sack or quietly take credit for it. He chose both. He condemned the violence, but also accepted the reunification of the Eastern Church under Rome, however temporary and coerced it was. Moral flexibility was something the Church had been practicing for centuries, and the events of 1204 required all of it. The Latin Empire of Constantinople, founded on blood and rubble, lasted only a few decades. It was never stable. The Crusaders didn't understand Byzantine administration. They alienated the locals. They couldn't hold territory beyond the city for long. Eventually, the Byzantines regrouped and retook the capital in 1261. But by then, the damage was done. The empire never fully recovered. Its treasury was gutted. its military weakened, its cultural legacy scattered across European vaults and churches. Constantinople would limp on until 1453, when it finally fell to the Ottoman Turks, a fall many trace directly back to the Fourth Crusade. In the end, the sack of Constantinople wasn't just a betrayal, it was a turning point, the moment the Crusades stopped pretending to be about faith and started looking unmistakably like conquest. It exposed the hypocrisy, the greed, and the fractured loyalties at the heart of the crusading movement. It revealed that the real enemy wasn't always far away, or even non-Christian. Sometimes the real enemy was just someone slightly different, slightly inconvenient, and slightly wealthier. And all of it was done in the name of Christ, of course, because nothing says piety like looting a sanctuary and setting fire to one of the holiest cities in the Christian world. For all the horror the Crusaders brought with them, the Islamic world didn't exactly meet them with one unified righteous fist. If anything, the first waves of Crusaders caught the Muslim territories off guard, not because they were militarily superior, but because no one could quite believe that so many heavily armed Europeans had wandered all the way across the continent just to bleed out under the Levantine sun. Initially, the Crusaders were seen not as divine punishment or ideological opponents, but as yet another group of foreign raiders. Annoying, yes. Dangerous, absolutely. But not unique. The region had dealt with Persians, Greeks, Mongols, and internal revolts. Crusaders were just another problem. For now, the early Islamic response was fragmented, much like everything else in the region. In the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the Muslim world was a patchwork of competing empires, emirates, caliphates, and dynasties. The Abbasid Caliphate still existed in Baghdad, but it had long since lost its grip on much of the eastern Mediterranean. The Fatimids ruled in Egypt, but their influence was waning. The Seljuk Turks dominated parts of Anatolia and Syria, but they too were splintering into rival factions. Unity, in theory, was achievable under the banner of Islam, but in practice, most rulers were far more interested in fighting each other than in responding to foreign invaders waving crosses. That began to change slowly, painfully, and only after it became clear that the Crusaders weren't just passing through. Once the Kingdom of Jerusalem and its satellite states were established, once holy cities like Antioch and Edessa had been taken and garrisoned, local rulers began to realize that this wasn't a one-off raid. It was occupation. Religious sites were being desecrated. Muslim civilians were being killed. Pilgrimages were disrupted. Trade routes were blocked. That's when the language of jihad, of holy war, began to re-emerge, not just as a slogan, but as a call to arms. One of the first major figures to answer that call was Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. A brutal, opportunistic warlord by all accounts, Zengi nonetheless managed to do something few others had: unite Muslim forces long enough to take back territory. In 1144, he captured Edessa, the first major Crusader stronghold to fall. This sent shockwaves through Europe and directly triggered the Second Crusade, which, as previously discussed, was a flaming pile of strategic failure. Zengi, however, didn't live long enough to capitalize fully on his success. He was assassinated by one of his own slaves. Power, as always, was temporary. His legacy, however, lived on, especially in his son, Nur ad-Din. If Zengi had been a brawler, Nur ad-Din was a planner. Charismatic, devout, and ruthlessly pragmatic, he managed to build a more cohesive front against the Crusader states. He pushed the idea of jihad more forcefully, using it both as a spiritual motivator and a tool for political unification. Under Nur ad-Din, Aleppo and Damascus, longtime rivals, were finally united. He centralized power. He improved administration. He even promoted religious scholars. who supported his ideology. But despite his successes, unity remained fragile, alliances frayed, governors squabbled. And when Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the cracks returned almost instantly. Enter Saladin, the most famous Muslim figure of the Crusades and arguably the only one that many Westerners can name without consulting a history book. Born in Tikrit, yes, that Tikrit, raised in Syria and eventually the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin had all the makings of a legend. He was a military genius, a devout Muslim, and a master of soft power, offering clemency to prisoners, funding hospitals, and cultivating an image of righteous leadership. But even Saladin didn't start as a unifier. He inherited Egypt through his service under Nur ad-Din's regime. And for years, he played a careful political game of consolidating power without provoking a dozen rival factions into rebellion. When he finally turned his full attention to the Crusader states, it wasn't just about piety. It was about securing trade routes, stabilizing borders, and eliminating a long-standing foreign threat that had become increasingly arrogant and deeply entrenched. His most famous victory came at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, where he annihilated a Crusader army, captured their key leaders, and seized the relic of the True Cross, the Crusaders' most prized talisman. From there, he retook Jerusalem, this time with far less violence than his Christian counterparts had shown almost a century earlier. The fall of Jerusalem sent Europe into panic mode and sparked the Third Crusade. But even with Saladin at the helm, the Islamic world remained politically volatile. Rivalries didn't disappear just because there was a Crusader threat. Saladin had to bribe, threaten, and occasionally fight his fellow Muslims to maintain control. He constantly struggled with logistics. Moving armies across vast, arid landscapes required food, water, and roads that didn't always exist. His campaigns were punctuated by famine, desertion, and financial collapse. Soldiers had to be paid. Cities had to be administered. Jihad was inspirational, but it didn't build supply chains. Maintaining unity in the name of God was one thing. Feeding 10,000 men in the middle of summer was another. After Saladin's death in 1193, things quickly fell apart. His empire fractured among his sons and relatives, who squabbled and divided territory like slices of spoiled bread. The fragile unity he'd built collapsed. New sultans rose, old grudges returned, and the Crusader presence, while weakened, remained. Over the next century, Muslim rulers continued to resist, some effectively, others less so. Cities like Acre and Tripoli changed hands. Battles raged, but the constant infighting and regional instability made it nearly impossible to mount a truly sustained continent-wide campaign to expel the Crusaders completely. Meanwhile, ordinary people, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, suffered. Cities were repeatedly besieged. Crops were burned. Wells were poisoned. Entire regions descended into famine, not because of divine wrath, but because armies kept trampling the irrigation systems. Trade routes were unsafe. Commerce slowed. Cultural centres shrank. War fatigue spread like a sickness. In some towns, children grew up knowing nothing but conflict. People moved not for opportunity, but for survival. And always in the background was the looming threat of the next crusade, the next siege, the next charismatic warlord promising that this time victory would be final. The Islamic response to the Crusades, then, was not a story of clean counterattacks and righteous triumph. It was a messy, complicated, and deeply human saga of ambition, betrayal, belief, and exhaustion. For every victory, there was a setback. For every unifying speech, a dozen whispered conspiracies. And through it all, people tried to survive. In the ruins of cities, in the silence after battles, in the brief moments of peace that fell between invasions. Because even when holy war was declared, Even when armies marched in God's name, the blood still soaked into the same soil, and the survivors still had to pick up the pieces. The Crusades are often remembered for the horrors that unfolded in the Holy Land, the sieges, the massacres, the brutal heat, and even more brutal theology. But long before most Crusaders ever glimpsed Jerusalem, the killing had already started. Not in distant deserts or foreign cities, but in the heart of Europe. As thousands of men, and a not insignificant number of enthusiastic civilians, set out on what was supposed to be a holy pilgrimage, they paused, frequently, and with increasing enthusiasm, to kill Jews. They didn't need much of an excuse. Medieval Europe was already a tinderbox of anti-Semitism, with Jewish communities scattered across cities in the Rhineland, places like Speyer, Worms and Mainz, living under fragile toleration. Jews occupied an uneasy social role. They were permitted to live, often in separate quarters, to lend money, because Christians weren't supposed to, and to serve as convenient scapegoats for basically any misfortune, from failed crops to unexpected nosebleeds. They were allowed to exist, more or less, because they were useful, but they were never safe. So when Pope Urban II called for a crusade in 1095 and promised a full spiritual pardon to anyone who went east to kill infidels, many crusaders interpreted that mission a little more broadly. Why walk all the way to Jerusalem, some reasoned, when there were already non-believers living just down the road? After all, hadn't the Jews killed Christ? Hadn't they rejected the gospel? Weren't they, conveniently, both visible and unarmed? And thus began one of the lesser discussed but utterly appalling aspects of the First Crusade, the Rhineland massacres, a series of coordinated, deliberate slaughters of Jewish communities in what is now modern-day Germany. One of the worst offenders was Count Amico of Flonheim, a minor noble with a major messiah complex. He gathered a band of crusaders who had apparently confused sainthood with serial killing, and in 1096 they began moving through the Rhineland, leaving a trail of devastation behind them. In Speyer, a small group of Jews were murdered. In Worms, the violence escalated. Synagogues were stormed, families dragged from homes, and entire communities forced to choose between forced baptism and death. Many chose death. Some were killed in the streets. Others took their own lives, slaughtering their own children to prevent them from being forcibly converted. In Mainz, the largest and most culturally significant Jewish community in the region was annihilated. Thousands were murdered in cold blood. The bishop tried to protect them. His guards were overwhelmed. These were not spontaneous riots. They were not chaotic, drunken outbursts. They were methodical. Preachers spread sermons of hate, cloaking anti-Semitism in religious fervour. Crusaders sang hymns while dragging Jews from their homes. Holy relics were carried as they looted Jewish property. It was a pogrom dressed up as pilgrimage, and the perpetrators believed they were doing God's work. Chroniclers described the killings with a disturbing blend of triumph and piety. Some tried to frame them as regrettable but necessary. Others recorded them with open admiration. Few condemned them. And it wasn't just the Rhineland. The wave of violence spread to other regions as well. In Prague, in Metz, in Regensburg, Jewish communities braced themselves every time a crusading mob passed through. Synagogues were ransacked, cemeteries were desecrated. Jewish families tried to hide, to negotiate, to flee. Some local bishops and lords attempted to intervene, offering sanctuary or paying off crusader bands to move along. But protection was uneven and often ineffective. There were always more mobs, always more sermons, always more excuses. The trauma inflicted during these massacres reverberated far beyond the physical destruction. Entire centres of Jewish scholarship were wiped out. Torah scrolls were burned, libraries destroyed, generations of community memory erased in the space of a week. Survivors carried the grief in silence, Some converted to Christianity under threat, only to return to Judaism in secret. Others left Europe altogether, migrating eastward in search of relative safety. Many simply vanished, names recorded in elegies, their stories left unfinished. What's perhaps most galling is how easily these atrocities were folded into the larger crusading narrative. For many participants, killing Jews wasn't a distraction from the Holy War. It was a warm-up, a spiritual prologue, something that made perfect sense in the fevered logic of religious absolution. If the goal was to cleanse the Holy Land, why not start at home? If God promised forgiveness, why not take a few extra souls along the way? This was the theology of bloodshed, efficient, cruel, and deeply infectious. The Church's response was tepid at best. Some bishops protested. Pope Urban II didn't officially endorse the massacres, but neither did he strongly condemn them. The Church hierarchy often seemed more concerned with maintaining the momentum of the crusade than with the inconvenient fact that its spiritual soldiers were murdering civilians in Christian cities. In some cases, those involved in the killings were quietly praised. Others faced no consequences at all. The victims, as always, had no voice, and it didn't stop with the First Crusade. Later campaigns brought similar horrors. During the Second and Third Crusades, Jewish communities were again threatened, extorted, and attacked. During the build-up to the Third Crusade, riots broke out in England. In 1190, the entire Jewish community of York was trapped in Clifford's Tower, and facing imminent slaughter, chose mass suicide instead. Across Europe, the pattern repeated. Crusade fever swept through, and Jewish blood followed. The irony, if you can call it that, is that many Jews had lived peacefully in these regions for centuries. They paid taxes, they lent money to the very nobles who would later tolerate their murder. They prayed for the safety of their neighbours. They wrote poetry, practiced medicine, copied manuscripts, and tried to build a life. They were Europeans, until they weren't. Until someone decided that piety meant purging the familiar, that holiness required a knife in the back of the people next door. In modern terms, we'd call it ethnic cleansing. Back then, it was just considered another step towards salvation. So while the Crusades marched toward Jerusalem under the banner of redemption, they left behind in Europe a long trail of ash, grief, and broken communities, not because they had to, not because of strategy, but because hate is portable. And it travelled well. By the 13th century, the Crusades had become less a religious mission and more a medieval franchise, bloated, confused, and increasingly desperate to justify its own existence. The early Crusades, brutal as they were, had at least pretended to follow a clear narrative. Reclaim the Holy Land, defend the faith, win back Jerusalem. But as time dragged on, and the victories grew scarcer, the entire crusading project began to unravel. And rather than admit it had run its course, Europe simply kept the brand alive by changing the definition of what a crusade actually was. At first, this meant launching new campaigns every time a crusader state sneezed. Lost a castle? Time for a crusade? Trade routes got disrupted. Better call up the papal war machine? But the reality was that each subsequent crusade required more money, more manpower, and more faith than the last, all of which were in increasingly short supply. After the disaster of the Fourth Crusade, trust in the crusading ideal had begun to erode. Nobles were hesitant to mortgage their estates again. Kings were more interested in fighting each other than going on expensive vacations to die in the Levant. And the average person, after watching wave after wave of crusaders return, broke, maimed or buried, had begun to wonder whether all this was really part of God's plan or just a very elaborate form of collective delusion. So the church got creative. If enthusiasm for crusading in the Holy Land was waning, perhaps the solution was to rebrand the crusade. Why go all the way to Jerusalem after all? when you could achieve salvation by slaughtering people much closer to home. The first major pivot came with the Albigensian Crusade in southern France. The Cathars, a Christian sect labelled heretical for believing in dualism and rejecting the authority of the Catholic Church, had set up shop in the region of Languedoc. Rather than try theological debate or negotiation, Pope Innocent III declared a full-scale crusade against them. This was not some border skirmish, it was a war of extermination. French nobles were encouraged to join with the promise of land and spiritual rewards. The result was a decades-long campaign of sieges, massacres, and cultural destruction that wiped out not just the Cathars, but much of the regional autonomy and intellectual life of southern France. At the infamous siege of Béziers in 1209, Crusaders were reported to have asked their leader how to distinguish heretics from true Catholics. His answer: kill them all. God will know his own. Whether he actually said it or not, it captured the spirit of the campaign. This was no longer about defending Christianity. It was about enforcing one very specific version of it with the sword. The fact that this crusade never left Europe didn't seem to bother anyone. It still counted, still earned indulgences, still got you out of purgatory, or at least into the good graces of the Pope, and possibly a few extra acres of vineyard. Soon the term crusade was being slapped on just about any campaign the Church found politically convenient. Crusades were declared against heretics in Bohemia, pagans in the Baltic, and even pirates in the Mediterranean. At one point, crusaders were sent to fight the Aragonese, fellow Christians, because the papacy didn't like their king. These weren't just holy wars. They were diplomatic tools, fundraisers, and sometimes personal vendettas dressed up in divine rhetoric. If you had enemies and a decent relationship with the Vatican, you could probably get a crusade declared against them. It was spiritual outsourcing, a weaponized brand. The 5th, 6th, and 7th Crusades tried to return focus to the Holy Land, but by then, the logistics had become unbearable. Armies were smaller, funding was tighter, and the sense of inevitability that had once driven the movement had vanished. The 5th Crusade failed to take Egypt. The 6th managed to secure Jerusalem through negotiation. An impressive feat, but one that didn't involve any bloodshed, which disappointed everyone who had shown up expecting a proper holy war. The 7th, led by the deeply pious King Louis IX of France, ended with him being captured and ransomed in Egypt. A humiliation only slightly softened by his personal ascension to sainthood after death. Meanwhile, the cost of crusading kept rising. Financially, these expeditions were black holes. Kings bankrupted themselves, outfitting ships and soldiers. Nobles sold off land and titles. Whole towns were taxed into oblivion. The church imposed special levies on clergy and lay people alike, turning salvation into a mandatory donation drive. And for what? For dwindling returns. The Crusader states were mostly gone. The routes were more dangerous. The Muslim world, now increasingly unified under powerful leaders like the Mamluks, was no longer the fractured mess of the early 12th century. The tide had turned, and Europe, still in denial, kept charging into it like a drunk trying to punch the ocean. Even the Templars and Hospitallers, military orders once viewed as the vanguard of Christian defence, began to lose their shine. Accusations of greed, corruption, and secret paganism followed them home. By the early 14th century, the Templars were being arrested, tortured, and executed, not by Muslims, but by fellow Christians who wanted their money and were tired of pretending otherwise. The image of the noble knight in shining armour had rusted. What remained were mercenaries, bureaucrats, and the growing stench of failure. Morale reached rock bottom. Recruitment became difficult. Fewer people were willing to die for a dream that had long since collapsed into a business model. Even the rhetoric began to sound hollow. Preachers still thundered about Jerusalem and the sins of the East, but the crowds were thinner. the donations smaller, and the enthusiasm clearly manufactured. By the time the Eighth Crusade limped into Tunisia in 1270, chosen not for its religious significance but for its strategic location, most people understood the truth. The age of crusading was over. King Louis IX died of dysentery shortly after landing. His troops went home. No one tried again with any real energy. What had begun as a spiritual revolution ended as a farce. The idea of the crusade had become a tired slogan, a catch-all term for any armed conflict the church wanted to dress up in theology. It had lost its focus, its direction, and its credibility. What was once a call to arms became background noise. The Holy Land, still out of reach, was no longer seen as winnable, and Europe, reeling from debt, division, and disillusionment, turned its gaze inward, toward plague, schism, and the long, slow collapse of the world that had once made the Crusades possible. By the end, crusading had become the medieval equivalent of a dying empire's PR campaign, loud, expensive, and tragically out of touch. No glory, no redemption, just heatstroke, taxes, and the lingering suspicion that maybe, just maybe, none of this had ever made any sense at all. When the dust finally settled, when the last Crusader castle crumbled and the cross-stamped banners were folded away, what remained wasn't glory, victory, or even meaningful progress. It was wreckage, cultural, political, spiritual wreckage. The Crusades didn't heal Christendom, they didn't unite Europe, they didn't liberate the Holy Land in any lasting way. What they did do, quite effectively, was spread generations of trauma, incinerate whole cities, sow irreversible distrust between faiths, and set the groundwork for centuries of geopolitical disaster. It's the kind of legacy you don't build a monument to. You just quietly inherit it and hope no one asks too many questions. Let's start with the obvious. Christian-Muslim relations were scorched beyond recognition. Prior to the First Crusade, the Islamic world and the Christian world had coexisted with a tense but functional understanding. There were wars, yes, and religious differences, of course, but there was also trade, diplomacy, and mutual tolerance in many places. Pilgrims from Europe had even visited Jerusalem under Muslim rule. It wasn't exactly a utopia, but it was sustainable. Then the Crusaders showed up with holy war stitched into their clothes and proceeded to murder their way across the Levant, claiming God's endorsement with every hacked limb. The psychological damage was enormous. Muslims remembered the massacres, the desecrations, the broken oaths. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099 became a rallying cry, a symbol of betrayal and brutality. For many in the Islamic world, the word crusader became synonymous not with religious conviction, but with arrogant violence. Outsiders who showed up uninvited, destroyed everything, and justified it with scripture. That image never really went away. Later Western invasions, colonialism, imperial mandates, even 20th century interventions were often viewed through the lens of crusade memory. And not without reason. The echoes were loud. For Jews, the legacy was even more grim. The Crusades introduced a new dimension of terror, not just persecution by law or marginalization by policy, but outright extermination. The Rhineland massacres weren't isolated incidents. They were systemic, deliberate, and horrifyingly popular. They taught Europe that anti-Semitic violence could be sanctified, that mobs could slaughter families in the name of faith and still claim righteousness. The precedent was set. Inquisitions, expulsions, forced conversions, and pogroms would follow across the centuries, often citing Crusade-era justifications. The idea that Jewish survival was conditional, tolerated only when politically useful, became deeply embedded in the European psyche. Even within Christianity itself, the Crusades left scars. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 shattered what little unity remained between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. It wasn't just a military failure, it was a cultural betrayal. Christians killing Christians, looting churches, burning relics, all in the name of the same God. The schism that had begun as a theological disagreement now became personal, bloody, and generational. The Orthodox world never forgot. To them, the Latin West was no longer misguided. It was dangerous. The political fallout lingered for centuries. Even into the modern era, Eastern and Western Christian leaders struggled to reconcile, their conversations haunted by the smoking ruins of medieval Byzantium. Then there's the political instability. The Crusades didn't just disrupt the Middle East, they destabilized Europe too. Kings and nobles who mortgaged their lands for crusading glory often returned bankrupt or dead. Territories were reshuffled. Dynasties collapsed. The constant call for crusading funds led to new taxes, new debts, and eventually new resentments. The papacy expanded its power by positioning itself as the gatekeeper of salvation, but that power came at a cost. When the church couldn't deliver consistent victory, its credibility took a hit. And when crusades were redirected against fellow Christians, that credibility cracked even further. Meanwhile, the military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights grew into powerful, semi-independent institutions. At first, they were noble, warrior monks protecting pilgrims and fighting the infidel. But soon they became landlords, bankers, and political players in their own right. The Templars, in particular, amassed incredible wealth and influence, operating across borders and maintaining their own fortresses, fleets, and financial networks. Eventually, their power became inconvenient. In the early 14th century, the French king decided he'd had enough and orchestrated their downfall with a mixture of debt, torture, and false charges of heresy. A fitting end, really. Another group eaten alive by the system it once served. On a cultural level, the Crusades distorted Europe's worldview. They reinforced the notion that faith justified violence, that religious identity was a license to kill, and that conquest could be sanctified with the right branding. They taught entire generations that the world was divided into believers and enemies, saved and damned, holy and unholy. That binary would be exported around the globe during Europe's later periods of exploration and colonization. Missionary work was often armed. Empires marched with crosses. The Crusades had ended, but the mindset stuck around. Economically, there were benefits for some. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa profited enormously by supplying ships, trade, and logistical support. Markets expanded. Mediterranean commerce surged, but the gains were uneven. Most crusaders returned poorer than they'd left. Entire regions were depopulated. Agriculture suffered. The cost of war drained treasuries and bled villages dry. For every port that prospered, a dozen towns fell into ruin. And what of the Holy Land itself, the object of all this effort? It remained contested. Cities changed hands, fortresses crumbled, local populations endured endless cycles of siege, rule, rebellion, and retribution. Christian control was never stable, never universal, never truly welcomed by the people who lived there. The idea of a permanent Latin kingdom in the East was always a fantasy. It faded as quickly as it was drawn on the maps. So, what did it all accomplish? A few temporary kingdoms, a long list of dead, some knightly titles that sounded impressive in Europe, but meant nothing to the people they governed. A scattering of relics and artifacts relocated to Western cathedrals, and an ocean of grief. The Crusades didn't uplift humanity, they exposed it, its capacity for cruelty, for self-deception, for sanctifying horror. They revealed how easily hope can be weaponized, how thoroughly belief can be twisted, and how long the shadows of those choices can stretch. We call them holy wars, but there was little holiness in what they left behind, only a legacy of division, disillusionment, and the uncomfortable awareness that people will kill for almost anything, so long as you tell them it's sacred. And yet, even in failure, they made history. Not the kind we celebrate, but the kind we quietly inherit. Bruises passed down in scripture, folklore, and uneasy alliances. Because the Crusades didn't end. They just stopped being called that. Looking back on the Crusades is a bit like studying a centuries-long fever dream. One filled with banners and blood, scripture and screams, prayer and plague. It began with a speech in France, delivered by a pope who promised salvation in exchange for violence, and it ended, if you can call it an end, with nothing to show for it but ruin. No permanent victories, no holy peace, no radiant age of Christian brotherhood. Just the long, slow unravelling of an idea that should never have lasted as long as it did. The Crusades were a spiritual sales pitch that spiralled into generational trauma, a public relations stunt that got wildly out of hand. And the final balance sheet reads like a cosmic joke. Everyone lost. No one got what they were promised. The soldiers, lords and peasants who marched east expecting eternal glory mostly found dysentery, debt, and a high likelihood of being hacked apart outside a fortress they couldn't even pronounce. Those who survived came home poorer, angrier, and often spiritually broken. The church promised them heaven. What they got was trench foot and PTSD centuries before either concept had a name. The kings and nobles who bankrolled the efforts hoped to gain land, influence, or at the very least, a little divine favour. But most gained only ulcers and a line of anxious creditors. For all the time, money, and blood they invested, the Holy Land remained as politically unstable and religiously diverse as ever, just with a lot more graves. The people who lived in the Middle East fared worse. For them, the Crusades weren't a story of distant glory or failed logistics. They were a rolling apocalypse. Their cities were sacked, their neighbours slaughtered, their economies wrecked. Every few decades brought a new wave of foreign invaders, each convinced they were the righteous ones, each leaving behind more wreckage than the last. It wasn't just the Crusaders they had to endure. It was the endless retaliation, the power vacuums, the sieges, the reprisals. Homes were burned, crops destroyed, libraries reduced to ash, and all of it was done in the name of holiness. Even those who weren't on the front lines felt the weight. The Jews of Europe, already living under suspicion, were hunted in their homes, burned in synagogues, forced to convert or die. The Crusades gave anti-Semitism theological teeth, turning hatred into a duty and bigotry into a virtue. Whole communities vanished, not because of military failure, but because of mob violence parading as piety. And back in Europe, ordinary citizens bore the financial burden. Taxes were levied, debts collected, crops requisitioned. The church's holy wars had to be funded, and that funding came from the same peasants who would never see the Holy Land except in stained glass windows. It's tempting to find a lesson in it all. To say the Crusades taught Europe something about the dangers of religious extremism, or the importance of diplomacy, or the limits of conquest. But history isn't that tidy. The Crusades didn't end because of some grand awakening or moral clarity. They ended because they stopped being useful, because the money dried up, because the death toll stopped impressing anyone, because people got bored, and when the next wave of plagues, invasions, and theological crises hit, Europe simply moved on to new catastrophes. And yet, the Crusades never really went away. Their imagery endured, etched into armour, carved into cathedrals, embroidered on the flags of later empires. Politicians and priests still invoked them. Popes kept issuing crusade bulls long after the ships stopped sailing. Even today, the word crusade carries a certain charge. It's been used to justify wars, civil reforms, and marketing campaigns. It still suggests righteousness, urgency, moral certainty. as if history hadn't made it abundantly clear that crusading rarely ends in anything but body piles and regret. The legacy, if you can call it that, is a cautionary tale wrapped in iron and incense. The Crusades show what happens when ideology outpaces empathy, when belief becomes a hammer, when faith forgets to ask questions. They reveal the human capacity to commit horror with conviction, to march into someone else's home with a sword and a hymn and still call yourself the hero. There were moments of courage, yes. There were acts of mercy, of real devotion, but they were drowned in a tide of slaughter that no prayer could wash clean. In the long run, the real victors were not kings or churches or knights. They were the worms, the microbes, the vultures, the desert winds that erased the footsteps of armies. For every relic enshrined in a cathedral, there were 1,000 corpses buried in unnamed pits. For every chronicle praising a holy warrior, there were burned villages and shattered bones. And for every monument raised in the name of Christendom, there were families who never came home. And yet, people kept going, kept rebuilding, kept trying to carve lives out of the ruins. Because that's what people do. After the Crusaders left, the survivors gathered what was left. They planted crops in fields where soldiers had died. They taught their children new languages, new prayers. They wrote poems and rebuilt walls. They remembered, not always kindly, and they moved forward, scarred but not erased. In the end, the Crusades weren't a war between good and evil. They weren't a clash of civilizations or a noble fight for truth. They were a mess of ambition, fear, vengeance, and confusion. A holy war waged by men who often had no idea what holiness meant, led by monarchs who mistook empire for virtue, cheered on by preachers who promised heaven and delivered hell. So sleep now, dear listener, beneath the weight of centuries. Sleep beneath the ashes of cities long forgotten. Sleep beneath banners soaked in mud and blood, beneath the illusions of glory and the silence that follows after trumpets fade. The Crusades are over, but their echoes remain in stone, in scripture, and in the quiet, terrible knowledge of what people are willing to do when they think God is watching. And that's the end of tonight's slow march through the scorched and sanctified wreckage of the Crusades. From fevered sermons and pointless pilgrimages to genocidal detours and collapsing kingdoms, it was less a holy war and more a centuries-long tantrum in chainmail. No one came out of it better, except perhaps the graveyards. Thanks for drifting through history with me. If you're still awake, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about which part of crusading would have broken you first. The dysentery, the heat stroke, or the crushing realization that God probably wasn't in charge of logistics. Sleep well.